Welcome to episode 152 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Dinning in Los Angeles.
John, you're not going to be in Los Angeles for much longer, as I hear it.
No, I'm headed out of here soon. I'm headed east. A lot east.
How far east?
Looking forward to it. Well, I'm crossing the ocean, so that far. Nowhere terribly exotic, but I've got an awful lot of places to see in a short amount of time. Should be fun.
Which is funny because I'm actually crossing the ocean about a week later, but I'm not going to see you over there.
You're not going quite as far east, if I'm correct.
It's true.
Yeah.
I'm going to the Emerald Isle, so...
It's a homecoming of sorts for either of us, but for you in particular. There's a Kaloran, Ireland, I think Kaloran pub? Tavern?
There is.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
And I'm going with a good friend of mine, and he and I are going to drive around, do some hiking, and I'm sure drink some Guinness. So
Nice.
We'll probably stop in at the old Kaloran pub.
I hope you do. I hope they give you free drinks. I'm going with a friend of mine as well, but they don't know me quite as well in Prague or Copenhagen, so we'll see.
Let's actually reverse field. Instead of going for the drink first, then based upon your non-exotic trip as you describe it, what's the music choice you made?
Well, I did make this one, and to the listeners out there, you'll know that it was me that made it because it's so sophisticated. You can't see us both laughing at that, but I promise that was tongue-in-cheek. Part of this trip I'm going to spend in Vienna, and I've got a night planned at the Vienna Opera House. Or not just the friend who's coming with me for parts of it, she's lovely, but my parents are actually going to fly over to Vienna and then bits of Budapest. So I'm taking them all to the opera. And one of the nights at the opera, we're going to go see Vivaldi's Four Seasons. So that's what I chose for the music here. It's wonderful.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, I don't know. Try not to sound too pretentious, but it's hard not to.
I want to know how many drinks you're going to have before you go to the opera house.
I'm going to drink nothing but like bottom shelf tequila and show up and smash champagne glasses.
Don't do that to your parents, who I like quite a bit.
My dad's first question, do I have to wear a tux? I said, Dad,
yes.
It's recommended. I'll rent you one.
Does he have one? Well,
yes, so that's where the music came
opera
from. Things get decidedly less fancy as we get to the drinks, though, I think.
Absolutely.
You go first.
No, I was going to say you go first because you're the one with the April LSAT score drink.
That is true. I just made up a drink for this one. I've been hearing so many horror stories from people, mostly on Reddit, but we've seen them elsewhere, about the April score release that happened this past Wednesday. And a lot of people sadly were disappointed in the results that they got, shocked even by the results. And so I looked around at what I have to drink here and made a rum and lemonade that I have termed Paranoia Punch, which is just, again, a nod to the conspiracy theories out there. I couldn't come up with a good conspiracy name. Conspiracy cocktail? I just felt a little clumsy. So I went with Paranoia Punch, and I'm sure there's an actual one that I've done disservice to, but I'm drinking rum and lemonade and telling everyone with an April score that didn't live up to their expectations, cancel it and try again. Yeah,
that is the right move. I made a comment about this at the mini ball at the very end in kind of like the Q&A segment. I've looked at the stats now. They don't appear to be entirely out of line. I have to go a little bit deeper, but I'll probably post something on Twitter in the next couple of days that gives an overview, because now that we have the numbers back from April, I can make a point-to-point comparison of the scores before and after and see whether or not they align.
Yeah.
So we'll see about that. That's coming up.
I wouldn't be so glib. Just no, I wouldn't be so glib about this if I thought there was any real merit to it. From everything I've seen, and you've seen even more, I think this was not so much an aberration and certainly not some sort of malice. I think that this is just sometimes how the LSAT is. It can sneak up on you in horrible ways.
Yeah, and I said this in the comments when I was answering live the other night. This is a test that's been used before. All the tests really had been. And systemically, it's exceedingly unlikely there was some type of issue. That's why they wait a couple of weeks to release scores so they can run tests. So I don't think that there is actually any systemic problem. I know that disappoints some people, but that's, part of what I think we try to do is be real.
Yeah, it's honest. So do the best we can. I'm sorry for the people that, again, were underwhelmed. What are you drinking, by the way?
I'm actually drinking something that is a nod to the topic of the day, which is about letters of recommendation.
Okay.
And I've been wanting to drink this for a while. I had a student last September who I started chatting with during test day. They'd been kicked out of their test. It was a technical issue. They didn't do something wrong. They'd been kicked out. They knew that they were going to have to do the retake like 10 days later. So they started drinking. And what they were drinking was something I'd really never heard of called an apricot vieux, which is essentially old apricot, if you're looking at it. And it's basically rum and apricot liqueur and a bunch of different bitters and stuff like that. So I was like, I cannot think of an occasion where I would drink this anytime soon. And then I was like, wait, somebody recommended something a while back that I wanted to try. This is it. And of course, the topic of today is recommendations. So that's about the closest alignment I could get. That makes
sense. If anybody's listening to this and trying to like phonetically search for Dave's drink, as I would be, is that apricot with a B?
It looks like apricot, but it's got a B, and it's apricot.
That's the way you said it, which sounds correct. But
yeah, it's French, and then vieux, VIEUX. So old apricot.
Well, there you go.
Or maybe apricot isn't exactly apricot, but I'm going to say that it is.
That's fine. I'm just glad you put the
views
right emphasis.
Regardless,
let's get to the LSAT
Jon,
world.
You tell us about the LSAT world. Aside from April coming out, what's coming up here?
Yeah, so a couple tests obviously on the horizon. We've got the June test. It's the next one. May this month, happily off. The registration for that has passed. That was, I believe, April 23rd. The dates of that, they've added a day. Hooray. So now there's a Wednesday of the June test. It begins on June 5th and runs through Saturday, June 8th. And you'll get your scores back for that on June 26th, which is the typical Wednesday. If you are taking that test, and here's a more fun thing for me to emphasize, we just did a free webinar this past Wednesday night, specifically for the June 2024 LSAT. That is now available. The recording of it is now available on our website. You can go right to our webinars or seminars page and request access to that. And you can also track me or Dave down, and we'll try to point you in the right direction if you need. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Reddit. So is Dave. So we can help out with that. But definitely go check out that mini ball. I think it was not only a fun session, but the feedback that I got in terms of like people's excitement about what it means was pretty cool.
Which is an interesting one because that is the last crystal ball or mini ball that involves logic games.
You had to bring that up.
Yeah, I did have to bring that up. Which brings us actually to the next test that's coming up, which is August of 2024, the first of the new format LSATs with 2 scored logical reasoning, 1 scored reading comprehension, and no scored logic games. That test is going to be over 4 days. It's Wednesday, August 7th through Saturday, August 10th. Scores will then come out at the end of August on the 28th. Right now, you cannot register for that test, but it is coming up soon. I have reliable information from our friends at LSAC that it should be by mid-May at the latest. They're hoping for earlier, so I would keep on watching it over the next week. They'll open up registration for every 2024-2025 test, so everything through the fall of 24 and the spring of 2025, all at once. So then you can register for any LSAT that you want to register for in that time period.
There you go. Yeah, I imagine early next week is probably when that'll open up. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, and if you're taking one of those LSATs, obviously you won't have to deal with logic games anymore. Right now, if you're in one of our courses, you can take practice tests and so forth that don't have logic games as part of them. And then we've just released a whole new set of courses that are different in format than our old courses, which we now call legacy courses. And you can sign up for those. They're all subscription. They're all monthly based. Jon and I have taught a lot of the basic lessons in those courses, and then we do daily live classes as well. Some of which Jon and I teach when he's not in Vienna listening to the symphony.
That's right. Or when I'm not in anywhere else, frankly. It's going to take a very special circumstance for me to teach too many of those, but I will do some, I imagine, likewise for yourself.
This is an essential difference between us, Jon. You're going to Vienna to listen to opera and symphony, and I'm going to Ireland to drink Guinness.
Yeah, and to listen to Irish people, which is its own symphony in a way.
Who's more fun?
I've been to enough Irish pubs to wonder where the real magic is.
I think I've won this one.
I'd trade with you. You don't want to take my parents to the opera while I get drunk in Ireland?
I really like your parents, so spending time with them would not be a problem. I've had some very good times with them before, and they trust me, surprisingly, which I certainly don't understand at this point.
Let's be sure not to ask them their preference, because I think I'd be sitting at home.
You might be out.
Yeah. All right. Moving on from my self-abuse, we do have a couple of webinars that are coming up this month. There's one on the 14th for advanced conditional reasoning. That is going to be relevant to the June test with games, but largely that's directed towards logical reasoning, which is relevant for longer. And then there's a comparative reading session on May 28th, relevant to everything.
Indeed. So with that out of the way, that's kind of like the house cleaning, admin stuff. Let's talk about letters of recommendation. And quite honestly, I think hopefully for many of you, this will be something where it's like it's out early enough to think about the process if you're applying in the fall. If you've just applied, it might give you some things to think about that, hey, in the future, I should do something like this. If you have to reapply, and I hope you don't, certainly would be helpful. But this is really our view on the best way to work through the letters of recommendation process and really how to think about them. Because I think a lot of people just go in a little bit haphazardly and they think, I'll just find some people to write it. And then they give them the form and they're like, there I go, I'm done. That is not how the best students do this. And it's certainly not how the most successful students do this. So no matter what the school is, they want to see really good letters of recommendation. And the higher you go in the chain, the more that they're going to give them some credence.
Yeah.
But the one thing I will say is, we talked about these before in webinars and so forth. There's a quote that our friend Mike Spivey made that I think really sets the table in terms of like the relative importance of how letters of recommendation can be viewed. And he said, it's the rare letter of recommendation that gets you admitted to a law school. Mm-hmm. So by itself, it won't get you admitted, but it's very possible for one to keep you out. And I think that is probably the clearest indication of things. There's not many that someone could write where it's like, boy, this person's getting in. But there are many letters of recommendation that could be written where the response is, I don't think we're going to accept this person.
Yeah.
So you need to, don't be in that group.
From the context of that, it seems like the some weight of this discussion should at least probably be devoted to the idea of what not to do. Because it sounds to me like this is far more dangerous than profitable, so to speak.
Yeah, this is like one of the pitfalls on the way to applying that you just need to successfully navigate. You have to skirt it on the way to putting everything together. And hopefully, that won't be too difficult. For some individuals, they can be in a tough position. And we'll talk a little bit about the options depending upon how long you've been out of school and things like that. But to me, it's more of a pitfall to be avoided as opposed to kind of like this great shining monument to how fabulous a student you're going to be.
Well, I know this time of year, we're getting a lot of people who probably are new to the whole just LSAT industry, this entire experience. So let's start, if you'll indulge it, with an overview of just what a letter of recommendation actually is, what these are, so that people understand what we're even talking about.
All right. So, John, what is a letter of recommendation?
Right. So we might abbreviate this throughout. I'll start with the acronym LOR. If we call it that, that just means letter of recommendation. Sometimes I've heard them called letters of reference. Reference is, I think, a less traditional way to refer to this, but there you go. Essentially what they are is there's someone who on your behalf writes a recommendation to a law school about the kind of student, applicant, graduate you will be. So in many ways, it's kind of a written compliment that describes the way that they see you performing in this next academic endeavor.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's really a short story about your abilities, written by someone who knows you but isn't you. So kind of like third-party confirmation. And they're trying to help the admissions committee get really a reliable view into your abilities, largely academic.
Your character as well.
Character as well. Yeah. So, and I always cut it down to really what it is whether or not you can make it in law school. Does this person have what it takes? Can they get through it? And is this a person you'd want to have in your school? That's really hard to do in a page or two, which is why these often won't get you in and of themselves. But it is really, really easy to scuttle somebody's chances if it's done wrong. So they can hurt you in that way.
So there you go. Yeah, it's strange to me in some ways that admissions officers prioritize so heavily the idea of what someone else thinks of an applicant. And at the same time, I mean, they're trying to get the most well-rounded view of who this person is. They use scores, they use credentials, they use work experience and background, they use personal statements, but they also want a third-party account, and that's what this provides.
Yeah, it's just think about it. It's one of a spectrum of points about you, just another data point they can add in, and everything gets weighed and balanced. Mm-hmm. So if we break down what a letter of rec is actually doing, there's probably two basic positive things that we would see. First off, it confirms what the committee is seeing with everything else, what they see in your personal statement, what they see in your transcript, and so forth. And it tells them, hey, this is a person that would be good here, that can actually be successful. And then also, it adds to the overall picture. Like you said, it's like we now have this additional data point, and in many cases, it can address issues that are not easy to address elsewhere. So it can illuminate areas that might look weak or they might not know a whole lot about, and eliminate those as concerns. Problem is they can hurt you as well.
Yeah. I don't want to front load this too much with, the pitfalls. But frankly, I think we need to if people aren't aware. So we've talked a lot about what they're intended to do. And I think for most people, it's easy to conceptualize here's what I would want someone to say about me. But imagine the things that could be said that could hurt. I think we should touch on those.
Well, as someone who's actually written a fair number of letters of recommendation, not for law schools, you don't want your LSAT teacher or instructor to be doing that. But for employees as references and things like that, it's hard. It really is hard to get specific at times if you don't know the person that well. There's certain challenges, it's time consuming. You have to really put in an effort. You can't blow it off. So let's talk about some of the potential ways this can actually hurt you. And I'll start with the very first one here, Jon.
Sure.
If you fail to follow the rules. You look at a law school, they usually will tell you quite specifically what they're looking for. Go ahead and follow their guidelines to the letter. Usually they're requesting 2, maybe 3. And so that is something where when you start thinking about the numbers, the very first thing is, all right, you need to have at least a certain number of letters, but also because you get to choose which ones get sent, it's probably going to be worth your time and effort to get more. And that isn't because you can read them, because, you want to waive your right for that, but it's because maybe somebody doesn't, deliver. Professors are notorious for saying, I'll have this done in 2 weeks. And then 6 months later, you're like, where is it? Oh, sorry. So you always want to ask for more that you can actually need in order to cover something. Or maybe somebody gives you feedback where you're like, they didn't probably do a good job with this. The classic being a professor says, hey, why don't you write it and I'll sign it? You need to run from that person because they're doing that to everybody, which means that probably over time they're getting called out on it. People will figure that out. So having extras is really important, but follow the rules is the very first way that you could make sure you don't get hurt by this. If they ask for something, deliver it to them.
Yeah. I mean, to me, if you're going to be a lawyer or if you're going to be a successful law student and you can't read the fine print or even the bold print, then certainly you've given some warning signs at the beginning. The other thing that I think goes wrong for a lot of people is there are some overwhelming misconceptions about who should be chosen to write this for you. In fact, so much so that I want to table this, if you'll indulge me, Dave, and we'll do a whole section on just who should write a letter of recommendation. But certainly choosing the wrong person to do it is another one of those upfront mistakes that I see a lot of people commit.
Yeah, we'll come back to this later, but you're entirely right. Yeah. A lot of times people have a certain idea of who they should have, some huge name, the most important title, and that is not necessarily the best person, which we'll get into a little bit more. And of course, a letter of rec can hurt you if it has all sorts of, bad traits itself. Let's say you chose the exact right person, you did everything the school asked for, but the letter itself is really brief. It's like a paragraph that just says, this is an excellent candidate and I recommend them heartily to your law school. Okay, that's basically useless. Or if it's really vague, it doesn't say anything about who you are or anything that you've done. Or if it has mistakes in it, like they have the wrong name on it, something like that.
You did see a personal statement once that was misspelled. They misspelled their first name. And I was like, oh, you guys seem tight. You guys seem really close. Yeah.
You don't even know who you are. If it contains errors that are obvious where it shows the person didn't put any care into it, that's a great way for an admissions committee to think, this person made a bad selection. And if you make a bad selection of your recommender, it does not reflect well on you. And then some letters of rec amazingly contain negative statements about the person. the classic, like, Jimmy is highly intelligent, but never quite lived up to his potential in my class. What the heck? That's really a backhanded compliment. Or Jimmy is brilliant, but headstrong, and he won't alter his opinions. Okay, does that sound like somebody you want in class where you're trying to learn? That doesn't sound like learning. That sounds like opinions already formed.
I completely get this one, by the way. I'm sure you do too. It's the kind of thing where they want to be transparent. They want to be honest. They would want to like infuse this with credibility. And one way to establish credibility is to be like, look, I'm going to be entirely candid. I'm going to throw some negatives in with the overwhelming pool of positives. But the fact of the matter is the negatives don't do anything but stand out. They don't overemphasize the positives, they outshine them. And that's a real problem.
Whenever you see the negative, the human mind immediately gravitates towards that. That's what these people reading letters of rec are actually looking for. Yes, they saw the 9 positives, but that one negative really gives them doubts.
Yeah.
It counterbalances the 9 positives there.
Well, there you go. Now that we've talked a little bit about essentially how these should be put together, you want to get to who should write them?
All right. So when we talk about who should write them, there are really 2 main groups of viable recommenders. So the first group is academic, professors, teaching assistants, people of that nature. And then the second is professional, managers, supervisors, people that you worked with closely in some cases. And really, the specific question of who you should choose is often dependent upon where you are in life. All right. So let's talk a little bit about that kind of distinction, because people who are in school or recently out of school are going to be expected to have several academic letters of rec. So as we kind of go through this, you usually want to say some type of faculty member, although that does include adjuncts, TAs, sure. They qualify. Usually you'd love to get one from within your major. Somebody who has a long list of publications or academic degrees, that's not essential. You're not looking for the biggest name brand in your department. In some cases, the law school wouldn't even know who that is or care. You're looking for somebody who actually knows you pretty well, that you worked with directly, who you wrote papers for, or you turned homework in, or you did classroom discussions or talked to outside, somebody that you got to know.
Yeah.
So when you're in school, that's really the expectation, is you're going to have like 2 academic letters of rec. If you have a job and you worked with a supervisor who loves you and thinks you're fantastic, you can pull off like the supervisor or manager, but you've got to have something academic.
Yeah. So the lesson for anyone listening to this, who I assume is the majority of our audience, if you're still in school or maybe you're just getting out or a year out, try to cultivate those relationships or maintain them, because you're going to need these people to do you this favor.
Yeah, and you're going to want them to want to do it, not just as an obligation or a burden, but like, hey, I'd love to do that for you. Because when you look at college professors, they get a lot of recommendations like this, because tons of people are coming out of college, going to various schools. And it doesn't matter whether it's law school or business school, these profs have to write a lot of these, and it takes work. So academic letters of recommendation, absolutely essential if you are in college or a recent graduate. Now, what happens though, John, if you've been out of college, say 4, 5, 10 years, and you've really lost touch with the campus and the professors that you worked with?
Yeah, I think the first thing to realize is don't panic. Law schools know that there are a lot of applicants like this. And the expectation is, I think, realistic, which is they don't expect that you've kept in close touch with your sophomore year chemistry professor or your, senior year, whoever guided you to your final thesis thing. Schools know that that's not a normal relationship to maintain. So they're willing to indulge recommendations from elsewhere that are a little more current, that are a little more personal to who your life becomes, essentially, what your life becomes as a graduate. So it's fine if you are, let's call it 3+ years out of college. I think it's fine to have all of your recommendations come from professional sources, colleagues, etc. That's the first thing.
I would agree with that. Whether or not it's 3, or 5 or whatever the number is. Ultimately, what you're looking for is somebody who can speak with authority about your abilities. And if you're 3 years out of school and you're like, look, I haven't kept in contact with these profs, they're not going to remember me, then move on. Try to find somebody who's a professional colleague, preferably a manager, supervisor type, but really you want somebody who can comment on your intellectual and related capabilities. I saw this project come to fruition. I saw this person work in front of other people. I saw the quality of output was incredibly high. That's really kind of like a key thing there. So especially once you move in and let's say you're 10 years out of school, don't even worry about it. It's understood by the law schools that, hey, you're just not going to have those academic kind of connections any longer because you haven't been in school for 10 years. I have a few friends that I've had for more than 10 years, but unless I'm working with them, there's not that many, that of those relationships that maintain themselves. It's tough.
Yeah, it's true. And think about the way that the nature of your relationship would change a little bit too. Because when I think about someone in college and the way that a professor or a supervisor or someone would describe them, it's highly academic, which is exactly what you would hope for going to law school. It's what they want to see. But some of the specialties that exist in a professional relationship might not translate quite as well. Like, this person is so organized. That's great. You should see what this person can do with a socket wrench. It's like, suddenly the utility of the recommendation or the utility of the compliment begins to pale a little bit when you compare it to an academic one. So I think about this a lot too, is who's going to be able to actually speak to your capabilities when it comes to the performance you're hoping to demonstrate in law school.
Yeah, your intellectual and related capabilities, what it would take to actually perform well in law school. So, where you are on kind of like the life journey from school to work and so forth is actually going to dictate to some extent what type of people you ask. So those are the two main categories though, Jon.
I like that. And it's conspicuous to me at this point that maybe there's a third category that has to be addressed, which is if you're going to talk about academic and you're going to talk about professional, what about personal? What about someone you just know in life? My aunt was a senator. My cousin's a Silicon Valley bigwig. Could someone like that write you a recommendation that would be, glowing or recommended?
Well, they could, but whether or not it's the best idea is a different question.
Would you put them further ahead in the line than, say, a boss?
No.
Or even a professor you've been out of touch with, say, 2 or 3 years?
I would. Probably not, tough. And here's the reason why. Of course, everything has potential, but when I look at that question, the first thing is they're going to be considered a biased source because they're related to you. And secondly, I don't know whether or not they've worked with you in a capacity that is actually useful for law schools. And so that's usually family and friends should not write recommendations. Yeah. That's kind of like an ironclad rule. Now, if you worked for your aunt who was, I don't know, working in the government and you were an intern there or whatever, that changes the relationship dimensionally so that I could see it.
Yeah.
But I would still be very wary about that relationship. You're looking for people who, know something about your performance. Usually friends and family know, what kind of barbecue you're eating on July 4th. So that's not really all that useful. It might be fun. So normally what we say is just say no to friends and family.
Yeah.
However, that brings up a really good point, because one of the things that people always ask us is they're like, well, I have different options of recommenders. We get this in admissions consulting all the time. And so we do a lot of consulting on who to actually choose. And the first thing I always tell people is the most important factor is how well the recommender knows you. They need to have some direct knowledge of who you are, your life, your goals, as well as some of your skills and abilities. And so, there's kind of an interesting exercise that we sometimes run through where we just say, hey, consider these two people. Which one would you choose? So I'll throw the first one out there.
All right.
You have the choice of getting a recommendation, one and only one, from the governor of your state, who your parents know well, or your manager at McDonald's, where you've worked there for the last, 3 years during your summers and when you were in high school, which was probably going to be better.
You're asking me. So in this hypothetical, just to understand it, I've worked at McDonald's for 3 years, but my parents know the governor.
Yeah. They think that you need to learn the value of hard work because you're overprivileged.
Have I at least moved up to the fryer?
You're now assistant shift manager, junior.
Well, all right. We're joking around, but let's imagine that I've become assistant shift manager, junior.
I don't even know if that's a title.
I'm in charge of the Tuesday breakfast rush. Let's say that's true. Then obviously what I've demonstrated at that McDonald's is so well worth cataloging and spotlighting. That's the easy choice of the two. despite knowing the governor, who hopefully will get me to senior shift manager.
But hasn't yet. So the governor hasn't done a whole lot for you.
I wrecked his hash browns one time. He never forgave me. But that's a really good example of, I think, a huge disparity. But in that case, go with the person who's closest to you, for sure.
You see, a lot of people tend towards the governor.
Of course.
It's the biggest name, and
it's
they
prestige.
think it'll look really good. It's prestige. The problem with the governor in this instance is the governor knows your parents. The governor doesn't know you. So what is the governor going to say? Nothing. No matter what he or she decides to write, it's not going to be very specific about you. Whereas your manager at that McDonald's for the last, 3 years is going to know you pretty well. You probably joked around with them. You've had some good times. They've seen you work. They're going to be a lot more specific. And in a few minutes, we'll get into exactly how to request that people write this so that no matter whether it was the governor or the manager, they would know what to do and what you're looking for. But ultimately, it's not about name brand. It's the same thing with like a big name professor. Doesn't matter if they don't know you. You have to choose people based upon how well they know you. And that is the golden rule here.
Yeah. Yeah. Right, familiarity, John. I think, trumps pretty much all. All right. Let me give you one while we're kind of doing this prestige versus familiarity or access, maybe. So imagine you had like a college freshman writing teacher where you really connected. You guys kind of grew together versus, and again, I don't know the relationship necessarily, but let's say a famous author that's aware of you. And these are two people who should presumably craft a really compelling personal statement. They both write for a living, but a famous author versus someone your college freshman year who really molded you into the author that you are.
Well, right away, the college freshman writing teacher probably has the advantage because they've already seen your work. They knew you. You've maintained contact with them now for a couple of years. So the relationship is more than just surface. So that's very promising to me. The famous author, again, is this a class that you took and you didn't really speak to them and you didn't know them that well? You just thought that they were amazing and that you'd love to have that as a recommendation? If that's the case, no. Then the famous author loses out here. If you got to know the famous author really well and you still correspond with them and you have their email address and you shoot messages back and forth once in a while, well, then maybe. Did they see the work that you did? It's not that people who are well-known or famous can't actually do great recommendations or aren't useful. Yeah. It's just that they're not helpful if they don't know you well. And so that's always the litmus test here. Just based upon like a surface thing, most people would say the famous author. I would probably say it's your college freshman writing teacher, and then I'd need more information. But they have the inside track when we start there.
Perfect. Now we agree again. Again, people tend to gravitate towards the idea of fame or think that notoriety is more significant. But familiarity beats notoriety almost every time.
Exactly. And let's go to a more realistic example, which is really kind of like the head of...
You're getting me out of McDonald's? All right.
Getting you out of your knowing the governor and a famous author.
That too.
But let's imagine you had the choice between the head of your academic department, who you don't know well, versus a teaching assistant that you got to know really well.
Okay.
Again, the so-called title doesn't matter. The head of your academic department doesn't know you. They lose immediately. The teaching assistant knows you. They're much better choice initially. And so that's the way to frame this discussion in your mind when you're thinking, do I choose person A or B? And you can choose both of them, but unless you get to see the letter, and usually you won't, you're probably going to think to yourself afterwards, the teaching assistant is the better choice there.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a good... Frankly, that breaks down every possible disparity in the spectrum from as far apart as you could get to as narrow.
Excellent. So then the question is, now you've decided who you want to ask. You wanted to ask that freshman writing teacher or your manager at McDonald's for that letter. Most people will then be like, here's the form. Can you fill this out and send it to this address when you're done? That is not the right way to do this. There is a professional way to approach this that makes you look better and makes your chances of success much, much higher. Excellent. So let's kind of run through that process. And the first thing is remember that all of your letters of recommendation are going to go to LSAC's Credential Assembly Service, the CAS. CAS includes a letter of rec service that allows you to manage your recommendations and send them to various schools or not send them, as the case may actually be. It allows you to pick and choose. so to speak. So we know that's where they're ultimately going to go, into this clearinghouse that will manage them all.
And standardize it a little bit.
It standardizes
right?
it. Yeah. It's a good service, and it is useful, and it just makes it a little bit, it makes it a place where you can have one letter of recommendation that goes to various schools, which is why you don't need to tell people, hey, write this for Cornell, and then write me another one for Georgetown. Oh, I've also decided to apply to Duke, so write that one as well. Can you imagine what a horrible nightmare world it would be if you had to, as a recommender, do that? No, you want them to write something that is actually fairly generic that can go to any school.
Sense. Generic in the sense that it's not everyone has like an address on it, essentially, but specific to the point of who you are.
You don't make it specific about schools.
Right. He'd be a great Duke graduate if that's too much.
Yeah. You don't want the letter to be generic, but the titling and the the salutation, so forth, doesn't have to be generic.
Exactly.
So let's talk about what it is that you're going to give to the recommender, because you're not just going to walk up and hand them a form that says, here we go. Usually what you want to do is actually create this almost like you're applying for a job. Mm-hmm. What you want to do is make their life as easy as possible and give them as much information as you possibly can. So either you're going to write a formal letter, or if you really know the person well, hopefully you're going to write them an email that contains all sorts of kind of like important points. Number one, you're going to express gratitude and thank them up front for doing this, because it is work for them, and it is not really what I consider to be the funnest thing I've ever done in my life. Second, you're going to explain exactly why you're requesting the letter of rec and why you're going to law school. What are your goals? Where do you hope to go with this? What's your process? Make them or help them understand what your pathway is and what your thinking is. You're also going to ask them if they think that they are capable of writing you an outstanding letter.
Yeah.
Sounds like a weird question, but sometimes it's really important to say to people is this something you can do, and will you be comfortable doing it? Occasionally you'll get people come back who say, I can't do it, I don't have the time, or I'm just not really comfortable. That's good. You don't want them writing you a letter, so that gives you an instantaneous exit right there.
It serves two purposes, really. It gives them an out, which is nice, because frankly, you don't want someone who's looking for an out to do this. And then the second thing is it holds them to a certain standard.
Absolutely.
That's very important.
The other thing you want to give them in that kind of like cover letter is a timeline and deadline information. Let them know when this is required by, and the little mini pro tip inside this is set the deadline a couple weeks early, so that even if they miss it, and a lot of them will, and historically I've watched this happen a lot, even if they miss it by a week, it's still there in time.
Yeah,
it's kind of like
I'm laughing about how my friends do dinner reservations with me, where like they tell me it's at 7, but it's really 7:30, so I'll be there on time.
Yes.
It's a little bit of that.
We do that for you because we know that you're perennially late.
Oh, no, you're including yourself in this.
Oh, yes, I've done it to you.
Yeah. I'm not even sure when Vienna happens, but I'm pretty sure I'll be there 2 days early. Oh, well.
If you're lucky. Well.
That is a good idea, though. Like, a lot of this is about how it is that you set yourself up for someone else to succeed on your behalf. And that's the way that I think about trying to at least like conceptualize it. And make it formal. I think a lot of people just shoot a text to a old professor or something they happen to be friends with, like, hey, would you mind doing this? And it's like, treat it with a little more gravitas than that, because you hope they actually demonstrate it in return.
Well, think about the process. I'm a person about to make a recommendation, and I get 2 requests, one from person A and one from person B. Person A just shoots me a brief message saying, hey, I'm going to law school. Can you write me a recommendation?
Right.
Okay. Person B is like, I realize this is a burden. Here's all this information about who I am. If you hadn't remembered, I'm sharing additional information that you might not have been aware of. Is this something you feel you can do? Mm-hmm. I'm already happier to do person B because I can see they're invested in the process and they're taking it seriously.
Yeah.
That's the expectation.
And they're going to make my job easier on their behalf, which I think is a big part of this too, is like the less work this is for the person doing you the favor, and it is a favor.
It's a huge favor.
The more
That's only part 1, though.
Yeah, get away with. So let's go to part 2.
Part 2 is where you actually deliver the documentation to them that allows them to make sure that what they're writing is as good as possible. And this is something that, again, you can attach via email, or you can just, print it out and give it to them. But you really should give them at least the following information. Give them a resume that's up to date so they have a quick glance. Even if they know you well, it never hurts for them to realize, oh, you did do that, or you did receive this award. They remember these things. It'll trigger certain memories that they have. If you have your personal statement finished, or at least reasonably well thought out, give them a copy of it or the draft so they can see what you're thinking. And that can feel a little bit personal. Guess what? That's okay. They're writing a recommendation that is personal to you, so it is okay. If the person is somebody academic, like a professor or TA, consider giving them a transcript of your performance so they can see, oh yeah, you did get an A in both the classes that I taught. And if you've written papers for them, give them the papers. You know, if that person, gave you an A+ and wrote several nice comments, they can look back and be like, oh yeah, I remember this person. It can just resurface memories because, look, we don't remember everything about everybody. And of course, if your recommender is going to, submit everything by paper and so forth, you can provide them with pre-addressed and pre-stamped envelopes to LSAC. Otherwise, there is a way for them to upload it straight to the LSAC site. But what you're trying to do there is, if they're a paper person, and especially some older professors are, make their life easier. So, and you can ask the recommender, is there anything else that I can provide to you that will make this easier? I'm trying to make your life as easy as possible, and sometimes more information is better. If it's not, I don't have to give you all of this information, but try to make it so it's as seamless and easy. You've got to do some pre-work here to make this easy. And as you said before, John, one of the key things is like an exit plan. Give the recommender an avenue to decline. Don't make it so they have to do it or they feel put into a corner, because that's the last person you want writing something for you.
That sense of obligation actually does shine through. I've read letters like this where I'm like, man, this reads like someone's, hostage note or something. It's like a ransom. If you have the sense that a recommender doesn't want to do it, don't keep the gun to their head. Go elsewhere.
Yeah, if somebody chooses not to write you one, they weren't someone who was going to write a good one in the first place. So that's better for you. Now you know that they're off the list. Consider it a win, not a loss.
You don't want to be surprisingly let down here, which means they don't submit by the right deadline, or they do it in a way that sounds very generic and like Mad Lib. Student A that's the sort of thing that I think a lot of these professors will default to if pressed. Don't press it if that's what you think might happen.
Well, if you're writing 30 of them in over a 2-week period, yeah, they could get pretty generic. And I've been in situations where I've been looking at people's applications and I'm like, essay looks good, LSAT's good, GPA and transcript look good. What am I missing here? They've got good extracurriculars. I'm like, I wonder what happened in those letters of rec, and I can't see them, so I'm only speculating. But sometimes I wonder if this wasn't a case where there was something in there that was bad. And sometimes I'll start asking questions saying, tell me more about who you chose as your recommender and why, and what did you provide them? And it's never determinative because we just can't see it. But sometimes I've walked away thinking, I have a bad feeling the recommendation just kept this person out of like a top law school.
And sometimes it's something as subtle as just, I get a bad vibe about this person based on what this, his choice or her choice had to say. I don't think there's a lot of ill intention here. I think there's a lot of like avoidable accidents.
Indeed. So on that note, John, let's talk about what a really good letter of recommendation looks like. Let's go into the features of those. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is important. I mean, we've talked a lot about like how to be wary, but I think it's important also to seize on the things that you can actually control. So the first thing is this, and maybe the most important pair of things, 1 and 2 that we'll hit here as a combo, is that they're detailed. So many of these things are generic, where they feel incredibly, we've talked about it already, like form letter-ish. Like he's got a letter recommendation template that he just plugs in names and adjectives and dates.
Mad Libs.
Exactly. And that is, incomprehensibly transparent. When schools see that, they know. When I see that, I know. And I don't even read these things professionally. I immediately can glean the fact that this was no thought.
I've had adcoms tell me, we know certain professors just mail it in.
Yeah.
Or they have the students try to write it. And when we see that, it's an immediate concern for us.
You mentioned something before. I'm going to circle back to it. And if this, again, cuts out your legs for later, I'm sorry. But the idea of not writing something on behalf of the recommender to then kind of resubmit for you, you sounded awfully against that. I wonder if maybe some collaboration here might be advisable.
Well, is it collaboration and a discussion about like what they should put in their letter, or is it you writing it?
All right. So obviously the way you've just framed that, the former is going to be okay. The latter is kind of where I'm at. Like, what if a professor or somebody came back to you and was like, look, I'll do this for you, but if you could just put together an outline, or if you could just string together 3 sentences for the meat of the thesis. I know it's all subtle. We're on a slippery.
You're crossing an ethical border there. To me, that is of deep concern. Yeah. Having a conversation saying these are some of my, best achievements, things I'm most proud of, and some of the things I think are strengths. That's one thing. But too often, you run across situations where people ask me, they say, well, my professor said he'd be happy to write it, but they would really prefer if I just wrote it, and then they'll read it, and if they approve of it, they'll sign it. That is a problem. You're crossing an ethical border there with the law schools. That is something that's going to come out eventually. Maybe it doesn't come out with you, but sooner or later, law schools are going to figure out that prof is doing that. Primarily, there's so many ways to tell, like the tonality of letters written by that person is going to change constantly.
Wow,
it's going to be like,
wildly. Right.
This is not even the same person. But obviously, you're going into a profession that values ethics very, very highly. You're going to have to face that with the bar. It's just not a good time to start with that process. It's also telling you that the prof doesn't care. And I say professor because I've seen it multiple times with professors doing this. Yeah. I haven't seen it so much with like managers, although I'm sure that it happens there as well. But really what that person is saying is, I really don't want to do this. So why don't you do it? And I'll just say that I did. That is a terrible way to get this as good as possible, because what you really want is the recommender to say something that you didn't anticipate that's incredibly positive.
Yeah.
You're looking for the recommender to say, hey, you didn't even know that I thought you were this great, but I'm going to add this in and bring something off the page. That professor who asks you to write the recommendation will never do that because you're writing it, and you know that you're not doing something that is right there, so don't do it.
Okay, good. And I think that actually brings us back to the first point here of like what the best letters of recommendation contain, which is detail, specifics, not generalities. And my favorite thing to read, honestly, across the board is anecdotes. Some story, some like experience that really speaks to the character or the quality you're trying to demonstrate without you having to speak in generalities about what that quality is.
Absolutely.
So someone did this thing that's representative versus this person, I believe, holds this quality or characteristic. It's much better to use this in anecdotes.
Don't tell me that this student is brilliant. Relay something they did in class that actually shows.
The illustration of brilliance. Exactly.
Yeah. We talk about this in the personal statement, and it holds true for recommenders as well. The best letters of rec will tell stories about the student where the reader is like, wow, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Or that's incredibly interesting.
What's your take on the nature of like competitiveness or relativism?
You mean comparing, having the recommender compare you to others?
Yeah, this is one of the greatest students I've ever seen, blah, 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 versus like just in isolation.
Absolutely 100% for it.
Me too.
I mean,
in fact, it always turns my head when I see it.
What is admissions? It's you're competing with other people. If a prof comes in there or your manager comes in there and says, this is the best person I've ever worked with, bar none, well, that's a pretty hearty endorsement. That's going to jump off the page. So there's nothing wrong with comparing you to other students. In fact, I would strongly recommend it. Now, what you don't want is this student's in the middle.
Right.
And that's not going to help you. It has to be a favorable comparison.
Yeah. If this McDonald's caught on fire and I could save one, it's Dave.
That's the only employee I'd take with me.
Yeah. It's the only employee I'd drag out of this burning McDonald's. Dave.
Yeah. So I think you're right. Detailed is a huge part of this. Personalization, knowing little things about you, your interests, your goals. something that goes beyond just an academic or professional relationship shows that this person does in fact know you.
Yeah.
And it can be anything.
I'll tell you one of my favorites, since you mentioned it can be anything. It's so off the wall, but it spoke to me. It was a professor writing about a student who had been a student of mine that I was tutoring. And they were like, I taught this professor how to play guitar. Would that be the kind of thing that would be worth including? I was like, are you kidding me? Absolutely, that's worth including. Have the professor be like, I can sit down and play, I don't know, James Taylor, because this student took a Saturday or two and showed me chords. It was the coolest thing. And I was like, that's so random, but that speaks to it validates the entire nature of what compliments could be given.
Well, at that point, it's quite clear that the professor knows the person
exactly
beyond just the classroom and is actually interested in them as a human. And that's really what you want. That those personal details bring the whole thing to life. They lend color to the recommendation. And adding on top of that, one of the other things I would say it's important is it can't be short.
Yeah.
2-3 paragraphs doesn't cut it. What you want to see is this thing go beyond a page. I would love to see a 1.5 to 2 pages on a recommendation. And that is because if you are being detailed and you are being personal, it takes time to relay that. You're not going to have enough room in a paragraph or two to do that. You're going to need a page or two to do it.
And that also allows for, I think, the final point here maybe to make, which is both breadth and depth, which is anything you can do to really cover a lot of ground with a recommendation is worthwhile. It can get narrow. It can get overly specific or overly narrow, and they just focus on one attribute. You know, this person's always the first one to class and the last one to leave. They came to every office hour. That's great, but say more things.
Yeah, cover skills, cover abilities. If you can, have the recommender address things that aren't addressed elsewhere that you want to have come off the page. Like first to class and attending all the office hours, that's just not really that special to me. That's run of the mill. It sounds great at first, and then you're like, what does that really say? Okay, you're a participant. You showed up. I'm happy for that, but I want, if I'm especially the better the law school, I want more than participants. I want leaders.
Or punctuality. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I want people who are taking matters into their own hands, not just appearing. So give me that. Don't give me they were punctual.
There you go.
Now, there's the thing there that came up, Jon, where it's just like, you know, I mentioned kind of like addressing things that go beyond the application information that you've already provided. And this to me is like one of the really most useful, often overlooked benefits of really good letters of rec. And you can pull this off with the right person. But a lot of times there's things in your application profile that really it's not easy to address either yourself, like you can't address it in the personal statement, or it's just something that's floating around as a piece you can't figure out how to put into place, but you still want it addressed. It could be a positive or a negative. A lot of times recommenders who you know well can actually pick up that thread for you. And that can address all sorts of things, like a minor arrest, for example. Maybe a recommender can be like, I know this happened to them, and I know the circumstances, it wasn't their fault, or they've taken accountability for it, that kind of thing. Or if there was some type of academic difficulty, and then the recommender can actually speak to that. Be like, I know they struggled that second semester of sophomore year, but that was because their mother was ill. And I talked to them repeatedly, and they were very concerned about their academic performance, but I advised them, put family first. We'll overcome this later, that kind of thing. All of a sudden, it's not you making an excuse. It's a recommender explaining to the admissions committee, this is how this actually worked. Or maybe you had some kind of unknown personal achievement that just doesn't fit really, really well, like some athletic achievement that you can't just list. And the recommender is like, you probably weren't even aware of this, but they were like the Tri-County champion in whatever. And so that kind of thing might actually be something that, depending upon the person, there's a way for the recommender to actually mitigate some kind of negative or play up some type of positive that doesn't easily fit elsewhere. And I love it when that actually happens, because it really neatly ties things together.
Well, this is such a clever aspect to it. Maybe the most, I'm going to linger here for a minute, if you'll indulge me. This might be the most non-intuitive part of this that we're going to talk about. So much of what we said, I think when people just take a moment to pause and consider, of course it makes sense. You want people to be more personal, closer relationships, more specific. But at the same time, the idea that you could somehow mitigate some sort of blemish on your application through someone else's voice, that doesn't get the attention that it deserves, but it is in many ways the best possible approach. So I'm glad, A, that you brought this up, but B, I hope you'll allow us to explore that a little more. So let's say you did have something go wrong in college. To have a college professor then come and try to explain those circumstances, that's a far better way to present it than you trying to, what sounds oftentimes like, make excuses.
Well, let's just say that the incident was bad enough that you wrote an addendum about it.
Okay.
Even when written well, a lot of times an addendum sounds like an excuse.
Yeah.
Even if it's just an explanation, even if you take absolute ownership of what happened and you say, you know, it was my responsibility, it won't happen again. Having a second person come in, especially a voice of authority, who is more of a trusted member of the community saying, hey, I witnessed this, I know what happened. And in fact, you know, there is a positive that comes out of this. Incredibly powerful, because now all of a sudden your explanation looks like an explanation. It doesn't feel like an excuse.
Yeah.
It's social confirmation from one of the most unimpeachable sources, you know, that is out there, is this professor who should have this particular understanding and knew you well enough to see you through it.
Yeah,
that's incredibly powerful.
That point up. Yeah, that's exactly another reason to have someone who knows you well to do this. Because from a third party, someone who's kind of removed from it, to be like, oh, I know they didn't actually mean that, versus like, you know, every other Tuesday when we would talk, hey, this is what this person was going through. The fact that you could have someone close to the situation explain the situation, hugely powerful.
Absolutely. So I think, you know, overall, that kind of is a pretty good overview of really the process, how to work through it, who to ask, what to give to them to ask, what their expectation is in terms of how you can write these things, and even some of the ways you can use the letter of recommendation beyond just saying, hey, this person is a great applicant, with a bunch of details to it. Let's close out, Jon, by kind of referring to something that Yale posted a while back when they were talking about.
I'm so glad you're doing this. I thought you might do this.
Letters of rec. And I think, you know, we've got a ton of letters of rec that, you know, at various webinars we've shown, you know, we anonymize them, remove all the kind of like personal information. But Yale did us the favor of kind of like posting a series of comments that they'd seen in letters of recommendation that blew them away. So literally what they called killer descriptive sentences or next level kind of letter of recommendation content. Jon, why don't you read the first one?
Sure. And remember, each of these is essentially the gold standard. If you can have something like this in one of your letters of recommendation, this turned the heads at Yale. So just that's the bar that we're trying to set for you here. And the first one that they actually have published for us is brackets, applicant is hands down the single best undergraduate I have ever taught in my 37 years of teaching, period. Oof. That's good.
Good win for that person.
Yeah.
You read that and your prof said that about you. Now you know why they're in Yale.
I should also clarify, none of this was written about me, nor Dave, nor could it have been, I don't think. And I'll speak for myself on the second half of that, but there's no chance a professor ever said that about me.
So don't disallow me.
All right. Okay.
You're out.
No, I'm definitely out. Read another one.
All right. So, of course, Yale anonymized all of these. So I'm not going to go through the bracket thing, but the next one is student A and student B, both of whom I taught, are currently at Yale Law School. Applicant is better than both of them put together. That's pretty powerful. That guy's an annihilator.
Yeah. I hope they actually anonymized the first two students' names, the current student.
Yeah. Doesn't matter who they are. That person sounds like an absolute annihilator academically and intellectually, because it takes two Yale law students. It's like, this person's better than both of them.
Put together. Yikes. Let me read one.
All right.
Here's the third one that Yale put out. At that point in the discussion, I almost sat down and let applicant teach the class. She could have done a better job. Again, I mean, these are just, you read something like that and you just immediately want this person to be a part of what you're trying to put together.
And you'd also know the topic that was being discussed, you know, whether it's philosophy or English or whatever, because you'd be able to see the recommender's position. But that's pretty powerful. Be like, look, they knew the topic as well, if not better than me. They were making obviously a class comment, and it was so authoritative and interesting. The prof was like, I'll sit down and let her take over. All right, let's go to the last one.
All right, there's a fourth one here. You do it.
It is, quote, any admissions officer who doesn't admit applicant is, and I beg your pardon, an idiot. A good way to insult the adcoms to positive effect. If you don't take this person, you're an idiot. They're amazing. I mean, that's really saying that this is the type of person that is so good that I consider if you can't see that, you're the problem, not the applicant. That's really powerful.
Yeah. That subtle nod to like politic. And I beg your pardon. Let them in or you're an idiot.
I don't mean this to be personally insulting, although it will be actually personally insulting when all is said and done.
It could be. Again, are these the kinds of things that are make or break for a letter recommendation? No. But you can see just how powerful this tool is in your LSAT application, LSAC application arsenal. This is the kind of thing where if put together correctly, you can have the impact that has Yale out there quoting your letter of recommendation.
Yeah, and let's not overplay the Yale angle. This is Yale. The applicants who get into Yale are uniformly excellent, and they've always impressed me. They take really great people there, and they have the opportunity to take the so-called cream of the crop. There is no expectation that if you're the listener out there that you're going to have anyone say this about you.
Right.
It's just not. It's not normal. If you can get it, fantastic. But what you're really looking for is that personal detail, almost that warmth that comes through, that relationship that has been built. So as Jon said before, if you're in school currently, build those relationships. And if you're at work right now, make sure that you work on those relationships with your managers or supervisors or people who are working really closely with you on big projects and what have you. Relationships matter in this process, and this is one of the ways it really shows up. So don't undervalue those.
Well said. Exactly. I know what you always ask me at the end of these, Dave, which is, do I have anything to add? The only thing I'll add to all of this is realize that you still have the ability to positively affect your admissions decisions and the way that schools are going to view and judge you and ultimately respond to you. This is one of the most powerful tools available to you. Get this right. And if you need help getting this right, we can help you. We have an entire department of experts who deal with this exact thing. Don't be shy to reach out and ask for some help, ask for some advice.
Yeah, and all of who have gone through the same process and know exactly how tough it is to actually get letters of rec and know the process for actually getting the right type of letter of recommendation. All right, Jon, on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or rating as well. And if you have any questions, send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. Perhaps after Jon returns from the symphony in Vienna, we'll do a mailbag and answer all sorts of different questions that we actually get. Until then, everybody stay safe out there, and we will talk to you soon.